Hi guys! I have to admit this is really intimidating for me because I normally don't do live videos. I normally just do voiceover anyway. So if you guys can hear me okay, could you just type yes in the chat? That way I know that everything's good with the audio. Okay, so thank you guys for taking a little bit of time out of your day. I have several questions that students have asked in the comment section of different videos and also over on Instagram. So I'm going to try to answer as many of these questions as possible. Thank you guys for typing in yes, that helps me a lot. I wanted to let you guys know that this is just going to be my opinion, and these are recommendations based on the parameters of the test. I am so proud of you guys for taking this exam in the conditions that we have, and I know it's really intimidating, so I want to try to do what I can to help you guys out. So if you guys have questions at any time, just go ahead and type them into the chat and I will do my best to answer them and keep up. But I've got an entire notebook here of all the questions that you guys have been asking, and they aren't really like in any particular order, so I'm just gonna kind of go with how people ask them. So the first question was, how do I actually access my exam? So just FYI, you guys are going to be getting an email, or you could also go into your My AP account. And so I'm hoping you guys have already started to get your testing information. Maybe you took a test last week, but yes, you should be able to view this video when I'm done, as long as I am able to upload it correctly. I think I know how to do that. Like I said, I'm a real rookie at this. So basically, one thing you guys might need to know about though is that you actually need to log on to your platform 30 minutes prior, because you have to do some identity questions. And apparently, from what I heard from students who took tests last week, they had to like type these like paragraphs that basically said like, I'm not gonna cheat and stuff. So just give yourself time to do that in advance, and then don't actually refresh your screen or hit the back arrow or anything, because the timer like countdown stuff for the test is just gonna like hit 0 and then your passage should appear. So that's just a little quick recap of how to actually access it. So some general questions that students have asked. I've gotten a lot of questions about intros and conclusions, and so I'm going to try to give you guys my best advice, but keep in mind that this is individualized. So if you are really strong at a conclusion paragraph and you feel like you need that, then by all means go for it. But one of the questions I keep getting is, do I need a conclusion? And to be honest, the answer is technically no. And that's because it doesn't say anything about that in the rubric. And I was actually talking to a friend of mine who is an AP reader, and she said that oftentimes she actually knows the score before she gets to that conclusion paragraph. And so she rarely has seen a conclusion elevate an essay. Now, that is just one person's opinion, but I want you guys to maybe not stress so much about the conclusion paragraph. I've had students in my own classroom basically end with a really well-developed body paragraph, and they just kind of finished out their essay and it worked. We know you only have 45 minutes to write this, so we are not looking for this perfectly polished essay. In fact, the College Board did say that students can earn a 3, a 4, or a 5 for an incomplete essay. Now, they didn't actually specify what incomplete means, but I think the general gist was that you don't have to be perfect. You don't have to finish it the way you might expect to do if you had more time, things like that. So lots of questions about formatting essays and how many body paragraphs and things like that. So I like to see well-developed body paragraphs. This is just the advice that I give to my students, but I tell them that I would rather see you write 2 well-developed body paragraphs than 3 mediocre ones. But sometimes students genuinely do want to write 3 body paragraphs, and that's totally okay. I don't want you guys thinking that you have to write 3 body paragraphs just to get a good score, because to be honest, sometimes that can feel very forced. So I was looking at an essay earlier from a student, and the body paragraphs were really short, and I wondered if that student had focused on developing 2 body paragraphs instead of trying to write 3, if the essay might have been a bit stronger. So just kind of keep that in mind. I would say you definitely want an introduction, but that intro can be very short. It can just be a thesis statement. You probably want to give a little bit of context as far as the passage, but a lot of times you can do this in 1 or 2 sentences, combining that with your thesis. So you don't need a long intro. And then you ideally want to hopefully work through that passage chronologically if possible. And so if you do 2 body paragraphs, that's totally okay. So I think that's a choice that you individually need to make. And I think it also might depend on the, honestly, the passage that you're given, because sometimes I have students who normally write 3 paragraphs, and every once in a while I'll give them a prompt and they only can write 2. So it really just depends. But conclusions are not technically necessary, so I would do that if you have time, but if not, don't freak out. And also, as far as body paragraphs, we want to look at this as quality over quantity. So development as opposed to number. Okay, so another question was, how do I identify choices more quickly? And this is something that I don't know I have the best advice for, but one of the things that you want to keep in mind is that you're probably going to notice different strategies and choices as you go, but they might not be significant. So for instance, I was reading a passage the other day and I saw a paradox in it, but I couldn't write a paragraph about that. I don't even know that I would include it in the essay. So when you are annotating, try to look for these major choices and more meaningful choices. I am working on a video for you guys. I recorded part of it today. It's going to be a long video. Usually my videos are kind of short, but I'm working through a passage and talking about what I would, I guess, annotate and how I would do that. And so it's a lengthier video, but one of the things that you want to look for are the more obvious choices. And I know that's probably not super helpful, but a lot of times it might be comparison or contrast or repetition. So you want to ask yourself, what is the writer doing and why is it significant? And a lot of times students readily find logos, ethos, and pathos, the appeals. And so if that's what you notice, that's great. One thing I would say is try to identify what is creating that appeal. So for instance, if you read a passage and you're like, okay, that's an emotional appeal, ask yourself, okay, which emotion is it? And then ask yourself, how is the writer creating this appeal? So is it through their detail maybe and their word choice? How is it being created? The same would go for logos. So logos can be things like maybe statistics or facts, examples. It doesn't have to be those things. It can be like just a logical sentence. Maybe it's a cause and effect relationship, or maybe it's a conditional sentence. So you want to examine what is creating that appeal as opposed to that appeal. And one of the things that I've kind of been nitpicking some of my students about is we want to avoid the phrase uses logos. We want to try not to use the verb uses because it's not very precise. And if you forget that on the day of the exam, it is not going to be the thing that does you in. So just take that for the advice that it is. But uses is not a precise term. So for instance, I coach soccer. And so if I told my athletes, hey, I want you to go use that soccer ball, they'd probably look at me like I was nuts. And some of them might start doing a warm-up drill, some of them might dribble, some might start shooting, some might sit on it. And so if I said, I want you to go dribble that ball, then they would know what I wanted. So instead of saying that the author uses logos, you want to look at how it's created. So maybe the author includes examples that create a logical argument. So as far as how to identify choices more quickly, I would say that for the exam, oftentimes in class, we want you guys to annotate quite a lot, and a lot of the things that you might notice might not be relevant. So don't get bogged down with like little things. You might want to just kind of focus on like these big picture choices. So think about how things are being created. And I would also say that I would look at things one paragraph at a time. So there's different approaches to how you can read the passage. Some students like to read the whole thing once all the way through just to kind of get the gist of it, and then they go back and annotate. And that could work if you're a quick reader. Other students like to read and annotate as they go. I think most of my students do it that way. And so you could look at things one paragraph at a time. Sometimes paragraphs aren't going to have a major choice. You might not have a lot of annotations for a particular paragraph. That's okay. So if it doesn't seem important, my recommendation would be to move on. Do you think we will be asked about point of view? No, I don't think so, because I think that's more of a lit thing. So I would take things one paragraph at a time. Don't keep rereading a paragraph if it's confusing. There are a few prompts where I know that the language is a bit tricky, and a lot of times this is for like pre 20th century stuff, so like 1800s, let's say. And so a lot of times if something doesn't make sense and you read it like maybe 4 times through, you're just wasting your time. But if you keep going in the passage, then as the writer develops their argument, they might clarify. So if something doesn't make sense, I wouldn't get stuck on a single paragraph or even a single word. I would just kind of keep going, because you are not being asked to analyze every single paragraph or every single line. You're just being asked to analyze the passage. So don't get tripped up too much, especially if it seems like it's a bit confusing. Just kind of push through, because sometimes you need to actually read the whole thing before you understand what it was about. How should we study for this exam? Watch my videos? I don't know. Unfortunately, AP Lang is not like AP Bio or AP History. It's an application of skills, so there isn't a lot of stuff that you can memorize. And so I would recommend, if it was me, I would go to the College Board's website, I would look at their student samples, and I would look at anything scoring for the new exam rubric a 4 out of 6 or higher. And for an old rubric, I would say probably a 6 out of 9 or higher. A 5 out of 9 used to be considered like passing or good, but I would say 6 out of 9 is what you would want to look for. So look at the College Board's official samples. You can find them on their website. And I would say read what those samples say, read the commentary, and kind of figure out how that is close to your own writing. I would also say that if you haven't done so, which I think most of you have, I would say that you should practice a timed writing experience, like a timed writing essay. And so I wouldn't do too many of these, but I might try to find one that is a contemporary passage and one that is an older passage. I would also say maybe try something that's a speech or a letter, and then maybe try like a memoir or something. There are some new passages. I believe students can access them on your like My AP website. I know teachers can access it in AP Classroom too. So I think you can access them even if your teacher doesn't assign it. So I would look at those as well, because a couple of them are good. I like the, I think her last name is Jaren, the lab girl, I think it's called. That one was good. And I liked the loose one. They used loose on the exam a few years ago, but I like this new passage. I personally am not a fan of Thoreau. I don't like that time period of literature, so I did not assign that one to my students. So not saying it's a bad passage, it's just not my favorite, and I didn't want to read 60 essays about Thoreau. So one question was, will they be more lenient this year in terms of scoring? No. They're going to evaluate you based on your essay. And keep in mind, I don't know if you guys are aware of this, but you guys are going to get different prompts. So everyone is getting rhetorical analysis. But if your exam is like the AP Lit exam, there are going to be different versions of the test. And so you are going to be looking at maybe a speech. Somebody else in your class might have a memoir. And so that does not change how you approach anything. But for AP Lit, one teacher that I know said that her students had up to 10 different passages. So you only get one, but she had students telling her about 10 distinct passages that they received. How would I recommend annotating? This kind of depends on which testing method you're doing. So if you're doing it on your computer, you probably have a few options. You can either type it in the doc that you intend to write your essay on, because remember, you can copy and paste your essay, so you just wouldn't include your notes. Or you can like download and upload. I think that might take longer, to be honest. So you could type out your notes if you want to. Some students have graphic organizers that they use in class. You could also just handwrite your notes. Unfortunately, trying to annotate on the screen might not be very easy or possible. I would be very leery of trying to do that just because of some of the complications that students have had so far, just my personal opinion. But I know there are different ways to do it. So I would say either typing it in your doc if you want to type those notes, or handwriting it. If you are doing it using your phone, you're probably going to just want to handwrite some notes. So I'm not really an expert on like different software that you could use to annotate on the screen, or if that is and is not allowed. So I'm just recommending that my own students either type their notes, use a graphic organizer of some sort, or just like handwrite it. So let's see. I'm trying to keep up with your questions and these guys. I'm sorry. This is not my usual method of doing videos. So someone asked if you have to write 600 words. No, let me clarify. The passage that you're given is going to be between 600 and 800 words approximately. They don't look at your word count at all. Do I recommend printing the passage? That really depends on your situation. I had someone ask if they should print it, their printer's in the other room. In that case, I would say probably not. So if you need to print, a couple things that I know from reading some experiences of AP Lit students are that there's a few different ways to do it. So for instance, you might hit Control P to print. When I do that on my computer, sometimes it's a bit slow. It generates a preview, and then when it does that, I can't see what's behind it. Like I wouldn't be able to see the passage. So for my computer, that would take time. If your computer is quicker, then maybe you would want to do that. Other students said that there was a way to do it using their like actual internet browser. So I don't think there's like a print icon. I didn't hear anyone mention that, but you can use the different controls on your computer. If you have the timer up, apparently some students who printed the passage and the timer was on their screen, then it cut off part of the passage. So if you realize that that happened, it's because the timer was up. I just would kind of note that maybe you need to look at your screen, but you would have most of the passage. So as far as printing, I know a lot of teachers are recommending that students just not do it. I don't want to make a statement like that. I think you need to choose what's best for you, but just keep in mind that there's no allowance for like printing time. You don't get to print it early. It's part of your ticking clock. And so I would say for most students, it's probably not best, but if you really need the printed passage to be successful on the exam, then that's a choice that you need to make. How do I include details from the prompt without copying? So I know a lot of students get worried about like, you know, not wanting to restate the prompt because they don't want to lose the thesis point. You can still use the wording in the prompt, but they're going to give you sort of like a superficial phrase and you need to be more specific. So if they say like, how does Albright convey her message about perseverance? You can use that expression, message of perseverance, but you just want to be a bit more specific about that. So what is her message? How does that relate to her audience? Things like that. So regardless of what your prompt is, whether it's about purpose or the message or the arguments, I like it when I can read an essay and I don't necessarily need to know what the prompt was because I could guess. So if they ask you about the if they ask you about the purpose, you want to make sure that you are clearly analyzing purpose. That's not to say that you don't have to analyze the message or anything like that, but whatever they give you, make sure that you are analyzing that. And so I was looking at two students' essays, my own students, and I couldn't remember the exact prompt I gave them. And one student, I couldn't figure it out. I was like, okay, I know she's writing about these choices and this author, and I understand what she's saying. And then I looked at the next student and I was like, oh, okay, yeah, that was the prompt, because the student wasn't truly directly answering the prompt. And so just don't lose sight of that as you are answering. So you're going to be asked about purpose, message, or argument. There's no real difference in my opinion. I guess they're different things, but I think they choose the phrasing based on the content of the passage. So if they ask how a writer develops their argument, that was one of the questions. How do I tackle that? I like to kind of break it up into the beginning, the middle, and the end. And so if someone's making an argument, first they have to make their major claim. They have to introduce it. And then they do a different choice usually to develop it, and then they conclude. And usually the conclusion has what we call a call to action because they want people to do something. So I like to break stuff up into usually 3 parts, the beginning, middle, and end. And so that kind of helps me look for development. So I would say, okay, what are they doing in the beginning? And then when you notice a different choice, what are they doing in the middle? What are they doing in the end? If you don't notice obvious choices, just kind of ask yourself, maybe what are they saying, and then ask yourself what are they doing. Sometimes students need to kind of take a step back to figure that out. Another thing was someone wanted to know if you can include details from the prompt or if that was copying. Yes, you can include the details. So if they tell you that somebody is an activist, then you're allowed to use that word. That's totally fine. Where do I include the historical context? Okay, not every passage is going to have historical context that you might be aware of, but for those of you who are in like American history, if you get a speech that's from a time period that you know about, you might know some outside knowledge, or maybe it's included in the prompt. Usually students put this in the intro, just kind of like setting the scene kind of thing, but you can incorporate it throughout the passage as well in different ways. So for instance, the lab girl prompt that was on College Board, like the AP Classroom kind of thing, I don't know that there was a lot of historical context that my students saw in that, so that would be different than if I gave them the loose piece about wartime. I would expect them to be analyzing the historical context there, so you need to kind of figure out, okay, is there some? And then what do I know about it from the prompt? Because they're going to give you enough in the prompt. If you have outside knowledge, great. A lot of people were asking about just general tips. I did a tips video, but let me kind of give you guys some other tips that like weren't in that video. So we already talked about appeals and like how we want to avoid the word uses. You want to be as specific as possible. So when you're given a direct audience or a reader, like if it's a letter and they tell you exactly who the reader or audience is, you want to use that information. You don't want to just refer to them as the reader. Now, if it's a memoir, you might not know who the target audience is. You might have to infer, but use the specifics that you're given. Another thing would be, one of the things that's helped my students is if I tell them, okay, think about what and why. When I had to break down rhetorical analysis to its simplest possible form to help my students understand it, what and why worked. So what is the writer doing? Why are they doing it? So if you have this total, like, I don't know, like blank moment during the day of the exam, and you're like, I don't even know what I'm doing. I don't know what my name is. I don't know what a rhetorical choice is. Don't Google rhetorical choices. I don't know if it's real or not, but somebody showed me a screenshot of like the Google searches during the AP Lit exam of like a spike of people searching for rhetorical devices. Don't go searching for it. Just ask yourself, what is the writer doing? You don't need these fancy terms. You don't need to know about polysyndeton and asyndeton and all these things that if you don't know what they are, they sound like diseases or something. You just need to know about basic things. The appeals, repetition, comparison, contrast. Look at their word choice, things like that. So what are they doing? Why are they doing it? And my last bit of advice as far as like 3 tips, I guess, would be just write. Because a lot of times if you get something on the paper, even if it's not your best, it at least gives your reader something to score. So I would say that you should apply the tips that you have learned either from hopefully some of my videos or in class, but I don't expect you to apply every single tip because you've only got 45 minutes. So there's sort of best practices that we suggest in class as teachers, but at the end of the day, you need to do what works best for you. And keep in mind, like it's your exam, so you want to write what you can and play to your strengths, and don't psych yourself out. Just don't get defeated before it starts, because your passage might be challenging, but view that as an opportunity, not as a reason to say, oh, I failed, because you don't know that you failed. The only way you fail essentially is if you either cheat and that you get caught, or if you don't try. So at least put something out there. And I like to tell my students, and maybe this is the coach in me, to think of it like a game, because you have essentially 6 possible points. I don't think most students are going to get the sophistication point. I think it's designed so that they won't. So think of it as a 5-point rubric. The thesis statement, you might want a sentence frame in advance, because you don't really want to be spending a lot of time crafting that. Like, you want it to be good, you want it to be defensible, but you don't want to be spending way too much time on a thesis. So that should be 1 point that hopefully you can get. And then you've got 4 points for evidence and commentary. So think of it as, what do I need to do to earn as many points as possible? Not what do I need to do to write the best essay of my life. Think of it as almost like a game. You're trying to score points. Will I keep the video up afterwards? Yes, as long as I can figure out how to do it. I should be able to do it, guys, but this is all new to me. So I will make sure that if I can, I will have it posted for you guys. So just kind of like a quick analogy going off of the whole like do what you need to do kind of thing, like within reason, like ethically do what you need to do. I coach soccer, and so there are several ways that students can score a goal, but that's kind of like writing a test. Like there are several ways that you can analyze a passage. So you need to do what works for you. I've had students score from an amazing shot, 20 yards out, upper corner. It was beautiful. I once had a student sit on the ball, and because she was pushed over, she stood up, turned around and kicked it in. That was how she scored her first goal ever. And I was just as happy about that goal as I was about the one that was like a super beautiful shot. And it's because they got the job done. So it doesn't have to be perfect and it doesn't have to be fancy. Like we know that you guys have time constraints. So please, like, I know it's easy to say, oh, just relax, but hopefully, you know that you've been trained for this and that we see how hard you guys are working. I know that AP teachers across the nation are so proud of their students. So I applaud you for that. Just do what you can and don't worry about it being perfect. A lot of people want to know how many choices they should talk about in their essay. Kind of hesitant to answer this question, but the idea would be that each body paragraph should have a main point. So you're either probably going to have 2 or 3. I see a lot of students doing 2, and I think that's totally fine. I would rather see them do 2 than 3 if the 3 paragraphs are going to be too like thin or underdeveloped. I say go for quality over quantity. So in theory, each paragraph should have its own main point. So presumably for a lot of students, if you're doing 1 choice per paragraph, because that's how a lot of students do it, then it's a minimum of 2 choices. That being said, I want you guys to recognize that choices sometimes work together. So for instance, you might talk about examples, and then you might talk about how it creates a logical appeal. You might look at the word choice in those examples. Maybe there's some contrast in that. You might look at the tone. So these factors can all be related. So when people ask how many choices, you want to have a main point for each of your paragraphs, but the choices don't operate in a vacuum. So they do work together. You don't want to do this laundry list though. You don't want to include every single thing that you see. You want to make sure that everything that you write basically answers the main point of the paragraph, and the main point of the paragraph is supposed to help you prove your thesis. So there isn't a magical number of choices. There isn't a magical number of sentences in each paragraph. It's whatever you need to do in order to answer those questions. Okay, so can I earn the sophistication point without a conclusion? Yes, you can. I don't think a conclusion automatically in any way guarantees you the sophistication point. So if you don't have time for it, then I would say focus on those body paragraphs. It's possible to have evidence and commentary in a conclusion, I suppose, but most students have it in their body paragraphs. So I would say your body paragraphs are going to be the most important thing, because that is going to be the most logical way to earn the bulk of your score. But again, it's a case-by-case basis thing. Someone wanted to know if the prompts that talk about like a message, purpose, or argument, sorry, I was blanking on the third one, if they are different or if you approach them differently. No, regardless of what your prompt is, you're still going to be looking for choices, and you're going to be analyzing that in relation to the rhetorical situation. So there is some nuance to it, but like there's not, in my opinion, you don't really change your approach. So just make sure that you're answering the question that you're given. So for instance, in some of the passages, like let's say they asked about Madeleine Albright's message of perseverance, that makes sense because it's a graduation speech, but they could have said, you know, how does she achieve her purpose? And you could still write an essay about it. So let's see. Tips for, someone wanted to know tips for using your phone. If you're using your phone, I'm assuming that you are going to be handwriting your essay. I would recommend for everybody, regardless of whether you're using a computer or a phone, that you put your AP ID and your initials on your either doc or your papers in advance. So you get 5 pieces of paper, like essentially you get like 5 pictures that you upload. So 1 photo is 1 page. I would recommend only writing on one side of the page, simply because I've had students submit work to me for school and they wrote on both sides and it was really hard to read it because like the ink bled through. So since you get 1 page per picture, then I would only write on one side of the page. I personally prefer when students use pen. blue or black ink, doesn't matter, but it's easier to read. So we don't care if you guys scribble out stuff. Like, it really doesn't bother us. You don't have to like totally scribble it out so no one can ever read it. You can just like cross it out and it's totally fine. If it's crossed out, your reader's not going to read it. So I would say that for your phone, you're going to need to be able to like see it clearly. So if you have any kind of way to prop it up, that might be something to think about. And also, if you have an iPhone, just make sure that you know how to convert your settings to change the picture options. There's a way to do it. It's super quick. And also, I would say maybe like in general for all of you guys, one thing that I think helps students is just like after you read, before you start writing your essay, take a second to plan. And you don't have to actually like write out an outline. I sometimes make my students do that in class, but class is different than the exam. But sometimes when I'm talking to a student about their essay, before they write it, I'll say, okay, what are you going to write about in body paragraph 1? What are you going to write about in body paragraph 2? And I might ask them, okay, how are these two things related? Like, what's the connection there? Because that might help you figure out the line of reasoning. So you can ask yourself those questions or you can take some notes. But I would say, as much as you probably feel like you're gonna have to rush through this, because I totally get that, you have 45 minutes, there are times when you might wanna like gather your thoughts a little bit. I would say like have like a tentative plan of just kind of like, okay, this is what I'm gonna talk about in 1 body paragraph and then 2, and if you intend to do a 3rd, that's cool. One thing that I've asked my students to do sometimes is like say they want to do 3 body paragraphs, that's their plan. I'll ask them like which paragraph has like, I guess like their most important commentary. Like, which paragraph do you think is going to be your strongest? Because usually students have like one paragraph that they think is going to be better than the others. At least my students do. And so if they say it's body paragraph 3, then they know that they have to pace to get there. And if that means that they only write 2 body paragraphs, they might have to kind of combine what they thought was going to be paragraph 2 and paragraph 3. So the one thing I would say is be careful not to like save your best ideas for the very end if you're not gonna get there. So just kind of be mindful of that. So if you have a plan in advance and you're like, okay, I absolutely need to get to this point. Like a lot of the times I tell my students, if there's a clear call to action, like that's what you need to get to. Because usually the call to action, the like, let's go to war or let's end child labor, like whatever the prompt is, usually that's at the end because we build to that. You can't just start your speech with like, hey guys, let's go to war now, because they're not going to agree with you. So, or at least most wouldn't. You have to convince them. So there's something that they're building to. And so if you look at it like that, okay, what are they building to? Then you might recognize, oh, okay, like that's something that I really want to include as well, because the call to action kind of relates to the purpose. Do you have videos that go over how to do an intro? Yes. One is current, one is from like last year. So I would go with my current stuff. Not that the old stuff is bad, but like it's a year old, so I don't even remember what I said. Let's see. Okay. Let me pause for a second because I've gone through a lot of questions that were sort of pre-asked. I know you guys have been typing in the chat. Let me see if I can actually, nope. Okay. Sorry. I don't know how to, oh, wait, is it that button? I feel like such an old teacher right now. I'm not actually that old, but I'm like, I don't know how to use technology. So let's see. Hopefully I can see these more clearly now because they were sort of like popping up and I couldn't keep up. So what questions do you guys have as far as the exam? I will do my best to answer any questions. All right, this is, let's see. Do you have a way of improving our analysis of articles? My favorite types of passages are speeches and letters, but if you have an article, I would say think about what the point of writing the article was. Like, why are they writing it? Because usually articles are in response to something, either some kind of like current event or maybe it's an opinion piece. So as with anything, figure out why, why they're writing it. I think that's a good starting place. One of my favorite articles to assign to students to read is called The C Word in the Hallways. It's about like mental health and stuff. But it takes you a little bit to realize, okay, that's what her argument is. So I would say, like in that particular article, she brings up some like recent events and stuff. So you're able to kind of figure out, oh, okay, this is what caused her to write that. And that might help you, because a lot of times with like speeches and letters and stuff, we're like, oh, okay, well, that's why they gave the speech. So with an article, you kind of have to like take a step back. As far as like how many points on an essay do you need for a 5, we don't know. Based on the way the rubric is worded, I recommend that students shoot for at least a 4, but we don't know exactly what is going to equate to what. Part of the reason is that there are going to be multiple prompts. So like I said earlier, you get one prompt, but like somebody else in your class might have a different prompt. So if your prompt is more challenging, there's a chance that you need a different cut score. So a cut score is what the College Board calls it when they determine, okay, like this essay score gets this composite. So I would say, in general, aim for a 4 out of 6, but I don't know for sure like what you need. Also, there was a comment made to us as teachers in a webinar where they said that the essays were going to be read, well, it was something about like each essay gets twice the looks, which implies that they're reading it twice. So I have no idea how they're going to factor that in. So I wouldn't worry about, oh, I need a certain score. I would just worry about like writing the best essay possible. But if you want a certain score, like minimum, I would say shoot for a 4 out of 6, just because the way it's worded, a 3 out of 6 doesn't really seem like the student did what they needed to do. Do you need a perfect score to get a 5? They said no. The College Board said, well, they said that you could have an imperfect essay and still get a good score. So in theory, a 6 out of 6 should be a 5, but they never said you need a perfect score to get a 5. All this stuff gets determined later, like well after your essays have been scored. So, and that's like that every year. So unfortunately, I can't give you guys any more concrete info than that, but like they determine that afterwards. Do you know ways to improve identifying rhetorical strategies? I did a video recently about like major choices. And so my best advice would be to like, you don't want to go looking for something, like you don't want to go, oh, where's the repetition in this passage? Because there might not be any. But there are certain choices that writers tend to use more frequently, or they're more obvious. So I would not get into like all the nitpicky stuff. A lot of the really fancy terms, I would keep it simple. Do you have a body paragraph outline? Sort of. I don't know if it's going to be super helpful. I tell my students to do a topic sentence and then evidence, commentary, and a concluding sentence. And then I always have to explain to them that those don't all have to be their own sentence. So what I mean by that is your topic sentence should sort of like introduce the main point of your paragraph, and you can include evidence in that topic sentence if you want to. A lot of times I personally do. You want to have more commentary than evidence, and you want your you want your commentary to follow your evidence. So I call it layers. I was giving feedback to a student earlier today, and his paragraphs were really short in my opinion, and it was because he only had one layer. So he had like a topic sentence, and then he included some evidence, like a direct quote in this case, and then a couple sentences of commentary, maybe like 1 or 2, and that kind of ended the paragraph. And so it's not about the number of sentences you write, but at the same time you want layers. So as far as how you create those layers, like let's say you're talking about repetition, you might find like 2 different pieces of evidence of something that's being repeated, or you might pull out like different parts of the phrasing or something. So it can be from the same choice, it can be from the same section of the passage. That's up to you. That kind of depends on your style. But I would say for a paragraph, you want layers of evidence and commentary, and I recommend at least 2 layers. Some students can do more than that, but usually like 2 is kind of like a good starting point. What do you do when the audience isn't specified? Depends. Sometimes you can infer. So for instance, if it's like an article, depending on where it was published, you might be able to make some inferences, but a lot of times in articles, there's, at least from what I've seen from the College Board, there's like phrases like those of us over 35. And then it's like, okay, they're talking to people over 35? Or are they talking to parents? Are they talking to grandparents? Are they talking to politicians, lawmakers? So figure out like what the writer wants, like what is their goal, like who are they trying to motivate? And then that might give you a clue as to who the audience is. So if they don't tell you, then you can hopefully infer that, but it needs to be like a logical inference. What if you misread the message? One tip I have for that, because it's kind of hard to like fix that issue, but one thing that kind of helps or camouflages that is that if you kind of like rephrase stuff differently throughout your essay, then you might get it right at some point. I know that's like really kind of like a band-aid on a problem kind of solution, but it's the same reason why a lot of times students will write their thesis and then in their intro and then rewrite it in their conclusion. Is the benefit to that, if you do that, you don't need to, but if you do, is that it might have been defensible the second time and not the first. And I find that sometimes when students do that, even if it was defensible the first time, the thesis that they write essentially in their conclusion is usually stronger, and it's because they then figured out their point. Sometimes you know what you want to say in your essay, but when you get to your conclusion, you're like, oh yeah, that's how I like intended to phrase this all along. So don't necessarily go back and edit your original thesis, just like rewrite it, because it can be anywhere in your essay. Do we need a conclusion? Technically, no. What should you be including in a conclusion? One thing might be to restate your thesis, but differently. And then as far as what else, people say like big picture stuff. So I kind of hate that phrase because it's still really broad, but you might look at the historical significance depending on your passage. So for instance, let's talk about like Gandhi's letter for a second, because that was last year's prompt. We know from the passage that he did in fact march. So the letter, he was talking about the possibility of it essentially, but we know that they did march and they didn't gain independence for 17 years. So you might be able to work like that knowledge into the conclusion, perhaps. Another thing that you could talk about for maybe like an article would be sort of like the social commentary. One question that I kind of ask students sometimes as far as like their conclusion is, okay, wait a minute. What happens if like the audience, not we're not the audience, but what happens if the audience listens to the speaker, and what happens if they don't? So for instance, with Florence Kelly, if they listen to her, then they will join with the men and end child labor. If they don't, then this is obviously going to continue. So that might not be the most sophisticated thing to say off the top of my head, but the idea is you could examine like the social significance of something or the historical significance of something. I did do a video about conclusions, like it was intros and conclusions, which had a couple samples. But the idea is sort of to kind of look at for lack of a better term, like the big picture. But it's not mandatory. Like if you would be better spent, like if your time would be better spent writing those body paragraphs, then I would do so. Conclusions can be tricky. I personally kind of don't like it when students just write like a quick, and these are the strategies that so-and-so used kind of sentence. I would like it to be a bit more like detailed than that. But at the same time, there are pros and cons to each. So like some people like to see it kind of all wrapped up, some people don't. But here's the thing that you guys also have to remember is that we as teachers can have preferences and stuff, but it's not about what we want. It's about what you did in relation to the rubric. So I could recommend things, but it's not mandatory unless it's stated in the rubric. And that's the benefit to having a rubric, is it's supposed to be like less of an opinion thing and more about the rubric, because I've seen it happen a few times where teachers, and they mean well, and I've probably done this myself, but we say, oh, I've told them not to do that several times, but then a student writes it a certain way. Okay, but were they wrong? Like you might have wanted them to analyze, I don't know, a metaphor, but they analyzed the word choice. Were they wrong? If the answer is no, if you still analyze something that is related to the passage, then you should be rewarded for that. So it's not about how I would write the essay, it's about what you did. Now, if you totally misinterpret something, that's a different story. But sometimes as teachers, we are so passionate that we think, oh, well, I wouldn't do that way, or I wouldn't do it that way. I wouldn't have taught it that way. Well, you're not the one taking the AP test. So that's just kind of like my 2 cents to hopefully like boost your confidence a little bit. Like, it's not about what we want, it's about what you did in relation to the rubric. Which strategies do you teach your students to help them get the sophistication point? I did a video on this. There is not a magical formula for this, and take this as it is, because this will not guarantee you the sophistication point. So sophistication can be because of your analysis and style. Usually when I see a student that has both, that's when I know, okay, they've gotten that point. One thing that I did with my students is I asked them, okay, why did the writer make this choice, and like, why not a different choice? And I would not do that in every paragraph because it would be super redundant. But for instance, this is not a College Board prompt, so this might not make as much sense, but I gave them a letter that Leonardo da Vinci wrote to try to get his first big job. And the letter is like a list of all the things that he could do for this Duke of Milan. And he starts talking about wartime stuff and then ends with peacetime. So I gave them a list of things that they could write about. But one of the things we talked about was, okay, why did he start with wartime and then shift to peacetime? Why not start with peacetime and then wartime? And so students had some answers about that. So thinking about what they did and why, as opposed to what they didn't do, could be something. This will not work with every passage, but it is one option. And there's a few more things I talk about in that video. So it has sophistication in the title. I was a little bit leery of calling it like how to earn the sophistication point because I don't want it to be clickbait. I don't want to mislead anybody, but there are some choices. And even if you don't actually get the sophistication point, some of those tips I think are good ways for students to just maybe add some nuance to their commentary. So I will hopefully refer you to that video for more info, but there is not a magical formula to earn the sophistication point because sophistication just sort of happens. And when we see it, we know why, but there isn't really an easy way to teach students how to do it. And my recommendation is really to focus on the evidence and commentary. So I know some writers are certainly capable of it, but the average student probably does not need to worry about the sophistication point. I think sometimes it's just something that stresses kids out. So I have a couple students that I literally told them pretend it's a 5-point rubric because they were like, I'm never gonna get that point. And they looked at it as they had failed, and it was like, well, you didn't get that 1 point, but you got these other ones. And so for me, sometimes it's a matter of just kind of perspective. What are some questions to develop commentary? I have a couple of videos on this. I hate it when people say, oh, well, you could just go watch this video. So let me think. I have like a document that I'm thinking of that I sometimes give my students, but I basically kind of give them some questions about like the different parts of the rhetorical situation. When I first started teaching AP Lang, one of the things that I would do is I would ask my students, okay, like why? Like, I know it sounds really dumb, but if you just keep asking yourself why, then you kind of like force yourself to like keep going and keep digging. One question that I repeatedly ask my students, and I don't know why I've kind of asked this so many times, but it just sort of works, is why this choice for this audience on this occasion? So kind of getting them to think, okay, why did the writer make this choice for this audience on this occasion? Because remember that they make choices based on who the audience is. And so, for instance, when I'm speaking to you guys, I'm making certain choices, but if this was a bunch of AP Lang teachers, I might make different choices. If I was speaking to my parents, I would make different choices. So the audience is a factor. Even if it's not directly stated, they're still making choices for that audience. So I do have like some ideas of questions, but I think the big thing is continuing to ask yourself, like, why are they doing this? Maybe like, why does this matter? Or why is this significant? And so it's a kind of open-ended question, but it could help if you're stuck. So if you're really stuck in your commentary, just say, okay, why? And then try to connect it to the rhetorical situation. So like soapstone or space cat. Hopefully that helps a little bit. What would be a College Board prompt? I'm not entirely sure that I understand that, but the College Board has prompts on their website. So each year they publish at least one prompt from that year's exam, and they have prompts going all the way back several years. So if you're curious, like if you type in like College Board prompts for AP Lang Q2, because it's rhetorical analysis, you should have some of my favorites if you're looking for recommendations. I love the Florence Kelly prompt. I don't know why, I just do. I would recommend that if you are like kind of looking to prepare, that you choose maybe one from like a current one, like a contemporary piece, like Madeleine Albright's commencement speech was pretty current, and maybe an older one. So the Abigail Adams prompt is a bit older. When I say older, I don't mean like the year that it was given on the exam. I mean like the time period in which it was written. And I might look at like a speech or a letter and maybe an article. Another good one that's not a speech or letter is the Louvre one. I forget which year he did it, or not he did it, but like which year they put him on the exam. I think it was 2013. So that one's like an excerpt of like his, I don't know if it's a memoir, but it's like a novel essentially. That one is a good one if you're looking for something that's not a speech or letter. What is something I can do right now to help me during the exam? I guess figure out what your weakness is and study that one thing. So if your weakness is commentary, then I would work on studying commentary. I don't think students need to go for like these big overall approaches. Trust yourself that you guys do know some stuff. Like you've been in this class for a year, and regardless of who your teacher is or what your natural abilities are, whether or not you like English, I would say that the goal would be to simply focus on what you need the most help with. So do you need help with time management? Do you need help with your commentary? I would try to keep it simple. If you try to tackle a bunch of things at once, you're just going to overwhelm yourself. So this is not about like, I don't know, in some sense it's kind of like a crash course, but like be strategic with what you're focusing on. How do I talk about shifts in tone in my commentary? Okay, so I tend to just say that the writer shifts from, and then like whenever you talk about shift, whether it's a shift in tone or shift in topic, you need to say like what they shifted from and what they shifted to. It's kind of like when people talk about comparisons and contrast, like you need to specify what they're comparing and what they're contrasting. So you need to be specific. So as far as shifts, you want to examine what things were like before the shift and what things were like after the shift. And you can use shift as a verb. So like he shifts from this to this, and you want to figure out why it's meaningful. And so that would help. Do we need to include line numbers? No, you don't. They don't require that. It's not part of your score. So for a synthesis, yes, you need to cite an actual source that they give you, but this is not a synthesis essay. So don't worry about line numbers. You're going to quote it, but you don't actually need to put the parenthetical citation with the line number. Trouble finding rhetorical devices. My recent video about like rhetorical choices and the most common ones probably would be the video that I've done that would be the most helpful. And that one's pretty recent on my channel. I did a couple last year that they're not bad, but like I made the recent one thinking of this exam. So I would say that would be the better one to start with in my opinion, just because it's more focused on sort of like the broad strokes as opposed to the other ones that are like examples and stuff. What are some important terms to know and mention in the essay? It's actually not really based on terms. Like you don't get points for using fancy words or anything. So I would say you need to understand concepts like argument and audience and stuff, but you don't impress your reader if you use fancy terms. It used to be that people would try to give students lists of all these terms to remember, but like that's not really relevant anymore, which is good news for you guys. How can I write the essay faster? Okay, so a couple things. Figure out if you need like notes or sentence frames that might help you figure out kind of like how you're going to prioritize things. So like, you know, if you know that you need to get to a certain bit of commentary, you want to work toward that. So even if you're not writing it faster, you are at least prioritizing what could get you more points. I would also say that it's kind of like a timing issue. Sometimes students tend to like cross stuff out or like reread stuff, and that might slow them down. But for me personally, I like to stop and reread, and if I don't, I feel like all out of sorts. So if you find that you're mismanaging your time, that would be something to consider. So it's really hard to tell someone how to write faster. But I think for me personally, when I understand a passage better, I tend to write faster. But again, you kind of can't control how well you understand a passage either. But I would say that like planning in advance, like coming up with a tentative outline, really simple. This is body paragraphs 1, main idea, body paragraph 2, here's what I'm talking about. That tends to help, because when students don't have a plan, then they like waste time or like they get stuck. So maybe one thing to do to write faster would be to have an outline. Can you have personality or a persuasive style? Yes. You can and probably should have some type of voice. Like, we don't really want cookie cutter essays, but that being said, like, how do you do that? It's hard. Students, I've seen some students do it really well. So if I have any advice for that, it would be this. Like, keep in mind that your AP reader is going to be somebody who either teaches AP Lang or works for, you know, a college, like they're a college professor. So I don't know which prompt you would get or what it would be, but you can have a little bit of personality, a little bit of humor, but don't lose sight of the task itself. And I would say, like, yes, we encourage you to have a voice, but I don't really have any tips on how to achieve that. But if you are asking that question, chances are you probably already have a voice that you're wanting to do. So I would say sometimes, like, it's really nice to get an essay that has a little bit of personality, because then it's like different. But we don't actually compare like student A to student B. So if I was reading someone's essay, I would only be evaluating them on what they said. I wouldn't be comparing them to like the previous student's essay that I read. So just kind of keep that in mind. What type of diction is most common? It really depends. When you're talking about diction, make sure that you put some kind of descriptor in front of it. So maybe it's patriotic diction, that kind of thing. So you need to figure out the type of word choice. A lot of times students want to say kind of like negative or positive, which if that's all you can think of at the time, fine, but try to think about the tone, because remember that word choice creates tone. So that might be a way to kind of figure out the type of diction. If you say something right and then say something wrong, can you lose a point? No, not necessarily. There is something in the rubric about like being like inconsistent or inaccurate. Go and look at the rubric. Look at the difference between a 2 and a 3, because now this is just off the top of my head, but I think with a 3 you can still have like slight misinterpretations and still earn a 3 out of 4 in evidence and commentary. So look at the rubric on that. But if it's a major misinterpretation, then no. But if it's really minor, like if you just said one thing wrong and then everything else was fine, then I would not stress about that. Because I've even seen essays when students like referred to like the audience instead of the reader, or like the speaker instead of the writer, or like they just sort of like I've seen essays where it was a male writer and they referred to the writer by she. I personally tend to just ignore that stuff. Like, does it stand out to me? Yes. Does it affect your score for class purposes? For me, no. I can't speak to every reader for the AP exam, but you know, some stuff happens. I would try to avoid those things, but you're under pressure. How do you know that you're misinterpreting something? You might not. Sometimes students kind of figure it out as they go. They might realize that, oh, hey, what I wrote doesn't make sense, or they keep reading the passage and they realize they misinterpreted something, but it's really hard to know when you're misinterpreting the passage. I don't really have any tips for that, unfortunately. I would just kind of say one thing to do would be to stop more frequently and ask yourself, like basically like what are they saying? So if the paragraph is really dense, like sometimes stuff from like the 1800s is kind of confusing. I sometimes stop after a sentence or two and I'm like, okay, wait a minute. It's almost like I translate. So like, what are they saying? And then I try to move on from there. So if you check in with yourself more frequently, then you might be less likely to misinterpret the passage. So maybe after every paragraph, if it's a really dense paragraph, then maybe check in between. But sometimes when students read the whole thing and they don't take a second to figure out what they're reading, then they might misinterpret things. And also just know that things kind of like build too. So that would be one suggestion. Tips for writing quickly. I wish I had better advice. practice, but we're 2 days away from the exam, so you might not be able to practice a ton. But I would say sometimes things that help me are like sentence frames and stuff like that, just like having an idea of sentences that I like for thesis statements and like topic sentences and stuff. So like that sometimes helps too, because then I at least kind of have a starter and then I don't feel as stuck. I have done a couple of videos on sentence frames that might help. So that would be something too, but it's really hard to teach someone how to write faster. I don't know that I have the best advice for that. Topic sentence frames. So one thing that helped a lot of my students was like going from body paragraph 1 to body paragraph 2, this like connection. So a lot of times students want to write another strategy the author uses is, and that's really plain. So I would tell them, like for body paragraph 2, to say something like, having already established, let's say it's Florence Kelly, having already established the urgency of child labor, Florence Kelly then uses detail. You probably don't want to say uses, but you guys get the idea. So basically like referencing what you said in your previous paragraph and then introducing your new idea. Sometimes that can help for a topic sentence. Otherwise, another one that students tend to use is kind of like, let's say it's contrast, like that's what your choice is. By contrasting this and this, the writer does that. Or like, the writer contrasts this and this in order to. So the topic sentence is just kind of going to kind of be like a main idea. So there's a few different ones that I personally have seen students use in different ways, but again, like you can manipulate sentence frames. The point of a sentence frame is for you to make it your own. And so you kind of plug stuff in, but you can absolutely just kind of like make it your own style. All right, so any other questions about anything? Should we explicitly say it or use the verb? I recommend using the verb in a lot of cases. So for instance, like if it's a metaphor, which the only metaphor that I've really seen people really talk about is in the Abigail Adams prompt, but it's a good example. So instead of saying she uses a metaphor, you would just say she compares. I tend to like it when students use the verb because it's more active, like in terms of the voice, and it's also usually more accurate. So there are definitely some verb lists out there if you search for like rhetorically accurate verbs, or your teacher might have a verb list. I tend to give my students a short list because sometimes a lot of these lists are super involved. Verbs that tend to drive commentary, at least in my opinion, would be things like highlights, suggests, implies, illustrates. So I tend to encourage students to maybe have like a list of maybe 6 to 10 verbs that they know how to use correctly. Because sometimes students tend to use words wrong. I'm trying to think of one that I saw recently. It was like, the student was trying to use either like employs or incorporates, but it just, or applies. I think it was applies. Like they apply a tone and it just didn't really sound good. So, tones are usually created, or you could say like they evoke a sense of. So if you are trying to prepare for the exam and you haven't made any kind of notes page, because you are allowed to have one, I would say maybe a thesis statement sentence frame that you like, and maybe a quick verbs list that could potentially help you. But I wouldn't put like 50 verbs on a piece of paper. I think that's just way too much. But that would be a way to potentially help things move along quickly as well if you kind of know the verbs that you want to use. But yes, verbs over nouns if at all possible. How would you recommend managing your time? Like, okay, so as far as like the time it takes to read, this is going to vary from person to person, but if it were me in general, I would spend no more than 10 minutes reading and annotating, maybe 12. I have a couple students that I could think of that probably need 12 minutes, but some students it might be less. The reason why is because you want to use the bulk of your time to write, but at the same time, you don't want to compromise your understanding of the passage for like the sake of all this extra time to write. So I recommend that you sort of figure it out for you. I did like a video, I think yesterday, about time management. I would come up with like a timetable. So I'm going to spend up to 10 minutes doing this, maybe like reading. I would spend no more than 5 minutes on an intro, because you really just need like a little bit of context in the thesis. You don't need this super long intro. And then if you intend to do 2 body paragraphs, figure out how long you have for that. If you intend to do 3, pace that out. So I would make myself a little time like list, and the timer on the exam is going to be counting down. So what you might want to do is indicate the time that would be on the clock as opposed to like you counting up, if that makes sense. So like for instance, if I say that I'm going to spend no more than 10 minutes reading, then if it's a 50-minute timer, I know that when the clock says 40 minutes, I need to move on. That way you're not having to like, I don't know, do math or something. Maybe you guys are better at math than I am, but I would recommend having a pacing guide for yourself. But as far as what that is, it's kind of individualized, but most students are going to need to read. You're going to need to write an intro and at least 2 body paragraphs, and then you kind of need to decide, am I doing 3 body paragraphs or a conclusion, or do I have just 2 really awesome body paragraphs, and then divide your time accordingly. Is SOAPs or space the rhetorical situation? Yes. Essentially. So the rhetorical situation is the writer or speaker, the audience. Geez, something just fell off my wall. Okay, random. So anyway, sorry about that, guys. The speaker or writer, the audience, the occasion, if you're talking about soapstone or Space Cat, it's going to be the context or exigence. And then the purpose and message. So either Soapstone or Space Cat, like I personally, I guess I use both of them. I used to prefer Soapstone, now I just kind of use them both. But that would be the rhetorical situation, yes. Okay, so how do you write an intro apart from a thesis? So I've done a couple of videos on this. I tell my students to think of it like an inverted triangle, meaning that it goes like down. So your thesis is going to be the most specific part. You can start with a hook. Some people say not to. The reason why I say that you could is because in college, when you don't have, a 45-minute timed writing experience, you might need to have a more developed intro. So when I say hook, I don't mean anything flashy. I mean like a universal truth. But that's optional. For this is totally optional. The context is the rhetorical situation. That is when you refer to the exact passage that you're talking about. So that's when you identify the writer, the audience, what type of passage it is. Is it a speech, a letter, that kind of thing. Your thesis and context can be combined. So the thesis is when you identify rhetorical choices. And again, I recommend the verb form, but if you do the noun form, that's totally fine. And usually it's like choices and purpose and also like message thrown in there as well. So it kind of depends on your prompt. So for an intro, sort of like the bare minimum would be the context, refer to your exact passage and just kind of clarify what's going on. And this could take 1 sentence and then your thesis, and that could be a second sentence, or you can kind of combine it. If you are the type of person who struggles getting started, then I would recommend a simpler intro. I have a couple students that tell me that their process is they need a longer intro. Like it helps them get the thoughts on paper. And I challenged them once to do a shorter intro. I said, just write me a thesis and go. And like they visibly could not do it. And that was when I, as a teacher, had to say, it's not about what I want, it's about what you can do. And so I have a couple students this year who write longer intros because that's their process, and it's not my place to tell them that that's not their process. So for most students, a quick intro will be sufficient, but sometimes there is benefit to doing a little bit more. Do what is best for you in the time you're given. It also kind of depends on how you feel about the passage. Can I save it for later? Yes, I'm going to try to. I'm absolutely going to try to. How many rhetorical devices? It depends. Ideally at least 1 per paragraph, but recognize that they can work together. So you're going to have like kind of a major one and then some supporting ones sometimes. Okay, so let's see. Trying to find like other questions that, how can we avoid uses and utilizes? Okay, good question. So I actually had I wish I had it written down. I had like a sample sentence that one of my students did. I think he said, and he's a great writer, he just will not stop using the word uses. And I tease him about this because he is a really strong writer. So he said something about by using logos, and then the rest of the sentence was great. So I told him there's a few different ways to fix that. So he could say by appealing to logic. So that would be kind of like the easiest fix. instead of saying uses logos by appealing to logic. The better fix would be to ask, like, what are they actually doing to create this logical appeal? So for this particular student, the thing that he was really talking about was the use of like facts and statistics. And so instead of saying by using logos, he could have said by including scientific facts. And that way it would still tell me that it was logical. You could say like by including scientific facts and then whatever the author's name is, the author asserts or logically conveys. So instead of saying logos, if you can incorporate the word logically or appealing to logic, or instead of uses, are they incorporating it? Or like, what are they really doing? Are they including something? Are they referring to something? So it's just about having some other like verbs in your arsenal. It kind of depends on the example though. So, I would say those might be some suggestions. Instead of doing one per device per paragraph, can you break it up in chronological order? Yes. So that is definitely a method to do. I actually tend to prefer that sometimes, but a lot of students don't necessarily know how to do that, and I don't want to stress anybody out for the exam. So a lot of readers prefer chronological analysis. So if you like to break it up into sections and stuff, that's totally fine. You are still going to assume, I'm assuming, like, analyze a major choice or choices in that section regardless. But yes, if you want to do a chronological analysis, like, absolutely fine. In fact, like, some people prefer that. So just kind of do what you think. So can you explain sophistication? Basically, it's when you as a writer have deeper insight into the passage or like really strong style. Usually both happen at the same time, though they don't have to. So I did do a video about that might give you some ideas of how to improve your sophistication, but basically it's for like the really, really strong analysis, like the really, really insightful interpretations of the passage. So obviously, like, you can look at the rubric to see what they say, but I would also say look at the samples that did score it and then look at the ones that didn't. So they have a couple samples that got a like 141, which is a 6, and then they have a couple that got like a 140. So I would look at the difference there, because if you're visual, that could really help you. Do you need 2 or 3 pieces of evidence? It kind of depends. I would say a minimum of 2, sometimes 3. It just really depends on your paragraph and what you have. If you have more evidence to include, remember that you want to follow up that evidence with commentary. So we want to create layers. You don't want to just include a ton of evidence and then some commentary and move on. So again, a lot of these things are just like really depends on your essay. Okay, what is a good way to analyze? I would look for major choices. I like to break up the passage into sections and kind of look at it that way. So when is the test? It's Wednesday, so this coming Wednesday in 2 days, May 20th. It depends on your time zone. So I'm in Central Time Zone. For us, it is 1 p.m. If you're on like the East Coast, it's 2. So you'll need to figure out for your time zone, but everybody's taking it at the same time for the May test. And then there is a June test as well. If you have an issue or if you need to somehow like not take it in May, there is a June test, but I would recommend trying to take it on Wednesday. Should you skip to the body paragraphs if you're stuck on a thesis? Yes, if you need that time, like, because your thesis could be anywhere in your essay. So you could, as long as you have one at some point, you can either go back and put it in the beginning, or if you build to it in the conclusion, that's fine. So if you're stuck on a thesis, I would say, and you want to move on to the body paragraphs, yes, but keep in mind that the body paragraphs are supposed to prove your thesis. So you might not really have very good direction with those body paragraphs if you don't have a thesis. So to solve that problem, I would say have a sentence frame ready so that you at least have a tentative idea. I would say that a thesis needs to be choices and purpose or message, so like what and why. So at least try to include something, even if it's not super strong. That way you at least have something to go off of. But I have seen it where students kind of had a weaker thesis and then in their conclusion it was much stronger because they actually like kind of figured out what they really wanted to say. So just kind of keep that in mind. Will you be able to print out the passage? Yes. should you that's entirely dependent on your situation, but yes, you are able to just know how to do that for your computer. So Control P usually works, but you could also use the features on your computer in your browser. If you have the timer up, then it might not print the whole passage, is what one of the AP Lit kids told me. So just kind of keep that in mind. So can you print? Yes. Should you? Kind of depends. What is the perfect conclusion? Oh goodness. I would say restating your thesis if needed and looking at the broader impact of the issue that you're talking about, either in terms of historical significance or social commentary. Would it be better to add more than one piece of would we get a better score if we add more than one piece of evidence? I would encourage you to have multiple pieces of evidence within a paragraph. Not a ton, but I would say that if your body paragraph only has one piece of evidence, then you probably haven't fully proven your point. So I would say maybe 2 pieces of evidence per paragraph minimum is probably going to suit you better, because I just read a student's essay where they only had 1 piece of evidence per paragraph and it felt like the essay was really underdeveloped. So I would say that you probably need like 2 pieces. I recommend layering it. So evidence, commentary, evidence, commentary. Are we allowed to write 2 body paragraphs or 3? Doesn't matter. Some students do 2, some do 3. Do what is going to help you develop your ideas best. Quality, not quantity. Where can I find the rubric? I would just Google it. It's on the College Board's website, but I would type in like AP Lang Q2 rubric. When I did that last time, the synthesis one popped up, but there is a document that has all 3 rubrics on it. And then, there is one that I found was just Q2. So it might take you a second to find it, but it's also on the College Board's website. That's if you can't find it by searching for it, go to the College Board's website. Can we just have a thesis as an intro? Yes. Scoring guidelines are on the College Board's website. Can you write an entire paragraph about tone? Technically, yes, I've seen it done. I personally don't tend to do that. I view tone as something that is created by other choices, but if you have a lot to say about tone and that's what you need to do that day, then go for it. So I have read essays where students have done that. It was for like a conference I went to, and it was kids from another school, and it was very obvious that they had just studied a lot about tone. But did they earn that point like on the rubric for being thorough? Yeah. Was it what I personally would have written about? No, but it's not about what I would do. It's about what they did and did they do it well. So you can, but recognize that tone usually is created by word choice and appeals and like other things. So I tend to kind of like sprinkle tone into the essay at different points. I don't usually group it together, but you're welcome to if that would help you. By 2 pieces of evidence, do you mean devices? Okay, I got cut off, sorry. When I say evidence, I mean either a direct quote or a paraphrase. So you can embed that into a sentence. I'm working on a video for you guys. There's like 2 videos. One where I show you how I would annotate a passage, because I got some requests for that, and one where I demo how to write an essay. Kind of an intimidating video to film, but they're long. I'm still working on them. They should be up tomorrow. They have to be up tomorrow because you guys take the test Wednesday. But hopefully I can explain it better there. It's one of those things that like I can try to explain it verbally, but if I could show you visually, it's probably easier for both of us. If I get a 99 on the exam, there's no 99. I don't quite know what that means. Your score is going to be out of 6, but you get a composite. I don't think you will necessarily know your essay score per se. In the past, you didn't know. So you'll know your composite score. And so the goal would be, for most students, a 3 composite or higher. How many choices? It depends. At least probably 1 per paragraph, unless you're working chronologically. How can you incorporate a short quote? Oh, I did a video on this. I've done 2 videos on this. Look for, if you go to like the recent videos, there's one about embedding evidence. I did another one about like the ICE quote method, which is what I call it. It's like introduce, cite, explain. Both work, but I tend to prefer my recent videos. So I would go to that one because I tried to demonstrate it there. But you don't want to use long quotes because it really slows your essay down and it probably wastes your time for a timed essay. It doesn't read as well. Basic rhetorical choices, look for a recent video on that, please. So can we copy and paste quotes? I heard someone say yes, but I don't know, because I'm not entirely sure that what they were saying was what I thought they were saying. So I'm not entirely sure on that. And unfortunately, I don't know. If anybody has taken an AP test so far and knows the answer, could you please tell that person? I know you can copy and paste from your doc to the exam, but as teachers, we don't get to see the exam interface. So I don't know if that's possible. It'd be nice, but I don't know if it's possible. If you're doing chronological, can you include several devices per paragraph? In theory, but like be very careful about you don't want more devices necessarily. It's not about, when we say like quality over quantity in terms of paragraphs, the same applies for devices. It's not about finding every single choice or device. It's about analyzing what you see well. So less is more in those cases. You want to identify something and analyze it very well. You don't want to just be like, oh, okay, well, he did this choice and this choice and this choice, because then you're not really commenting on anything. You're just listing it. Any tips for old letters? Okay, so I forgot which prompt it was. It was like, I think it was it someone writing to Charles Dickens or I don't know. There was one letter where like, it might not have been a College Board one, but like, oh no, I know what it was. It was relatively new, and it's not publicly available, but it's on AP Classroom. It was like this, I think it was like Browning, like the wife of Browning writing to Napoleon or something. I read that one and I was like, there's not a whole lot of really obvious choices here. But if you ask yourself what she's doing, then it might help. So like, for instance, this person was using flattery and they were also trying to be humble. So if you get stuck and you're like, I don't know what choices to say, like, especially for like an older piece, ask what they're doing. Like, are they, and like, think about the audience and writer relationship there, because like in this case, it was someone writing to Napoleon. So obviously like someone of like royal importance. And so they're going to have a more formal tone, and they're going to have to be humble, because you don't just walk up to royalty and be like, so this is what we're gonna do. You want to flatter them and be humble. So flattery and being humble, even humor, those are choices too. And so if you ask yourself, oh, Victor Hugo, that's right, yeah, because it was like about trying to get Victor Hugo like out of exile or something. Sorry, like all the prompts are blurring together at this point, because there's ones that are on the College Board and ones that I've seen in other resources. But yes, like this like flattery and humility kind of thing, like that might be a way in, is talking about like those as what she's doing, and then it pertains to tone as well. Will there ever be more than one piece of evidence that proves a choice? Yes, I think so. I'm not entirely sure that I understand that question, but like sometimes students ask like, what do I do if I can't find more than one piece of evidence about that choice? If that's your focal point, then you might want to take a step back. Like if you don't have a lot of evidence for it, that might be okay. Like if it's one metaphor, like the Abigail Adams prompt, there's one metaphor, but you can look at why that metaphor was significant to her son given his trip to France. You could look at the word choice in it and what she's actually comparing. So you might be paraphrasing the quote and not like direct quoting it, and that's still evidence as well. Let's see. Okay, yeah, you guys, if you're not getting your exam ticket, you can check My AP, but it should be emailed to you. There's ways to make sure that it was emailed to the right address. I know there were instances where students didn't get it because the wrong email was in there, or they didn't like enable notifications. But you can access it two different ways. So don't panic if you didn't get the email with it. You should be able to go to your My AP account, which is how you would have logged in to create an account and go to like that kind of stuff. How do you establish a consistent line of reasoning? You want to look for like the progressions or the movements of the piece, I think. So looking at how one choice leads into the next. So how do they introduce their argument, let's say? How do they develop it? How do they conclude? You want to show that these choices work together as opposed to viewing them as like separate entities. So kind of creating, like, in some sense, like a little bit of overlap there, like recognizing how different elements of the passage work together to create this like overall argument within the passage. I did do a video about that, but again, like may or may not be helpful. I think it was like a sentence frames video about line of reasoning. I tend to really like sentence frames. How do you write a thesis if you're doing it in chronological order? I would emphasize the verbs in that case. So just kind of look at like what's happening in the beginning, the middle, and the end. But verbs tend to lead to a stronger thesis anyway. Okay, so we've been going for a little while. I'm happy to stay on and keep answering questions. I'm trying to keep up. It's a little bit intimidating. If my CDs came from specific section of the text, would that be bad? Not okay. So like, are you asking like if you only analyze like one portion of the text, is that bad? You want to try to analyze the whole passage, but that does not mean every single paragraph. So at the very least, beginning, middle, and end, or like first half, second half, but you don't want to write your entire essay about only like half the passage. And when you're pulling evidence, ideally you would be pulling evidence from different parts of the passage. If you're working chronologically, then that kind of helps that, because you would be pulling from the beginning and then the next paragraph, the middle, and then the end kind of thing. So you do want to like really look at the whole passage. But when I say the whole passage, I don't mean every single paragraph. Like, yes, you should read it, but you don't have to pull evidence from every single paragraph. Kind of divide it into subsections, and that can help. Do you recommend a thesis as an intro? If you need to, yes. Like if you're pressed for time and you can't think of anything else to say, then don't stall out, just write a thesis. I would rather have you guys write something than trying to write a fancy intro, because quite frankly, in a lot of cases, the only point you get from your intro anyway is a thesis. So because it's a timed exam, I would say that if you can't get started and you can't think of how to really lead in, make sure you're referencing the specific passage, and a thesis is fine. That's how I teach my sophomores to do it when I have them do their first timed write, is I tell them like, okay, I've taught you how to write an intro, but if you can't write a fancy intro, you must at least have a thesis. And probably 80 to 90% of them only write a thesis because they panic, and that's totally okay. So I don't have a problem with it. Examples of thesis statements with verbs. I have a playlist on my channel about thesis statements, and some of them are about rhetorical analysis, and like so I might recommend looking at some of those as well. And in some of my videos, I talk about thesis statements even if that was not the main point of the video. So that would be a good place to look, I think. A few devices that are commonly used. I did also do a video on that. I'm sorry to keep recommending you guys to my videos. It's just that it's easier than trying to answer it again. Okay, so I'll wait for a couple more questions. How do you write a topic sentence without restating the thesis or taking away from the commentary? It's okay to actually have a little bit of commentary in your topic sentence. The topic sentence, you want to basically identify the major point that you're trying to make in that paragraph, and you can include a little bit of evidence if you need to, and commentary, but the idea would be that eventually you'd get to more commentary. So when I say a topic sentence and then evidence, commentary, those don't all have to be separate sentences. You can combine them. In fact, like oftentimes students do. So I wouldn't really stress about that. You just want your topic sentence to clearly identify what you're about to talk about, and ideally avoid the first choice the writer uses is. We want to try to be a bit more sophisticated than that. But like, don't really worry about like where your commentary is. Just kind of have it be throughout those paragraphs. So someone asked, what are soapstone and spacecat? So those are acronyms that a lot of AP Lang teachers use to explain the rhetorical situation. I think if you Google it, you could probably find like what they actually mean. I'm not gonna like tell you guys because some of you probably already know, but it's just a helpful way to remember different things to talk about. How long do you think is a good length for an essay? At minimum, if I had to give you guys a minimum, a short intro and at least 2 body paragraphs would kind of be like the bare minimum that I would want. When I say 2 body paragraphs though, I do mean developed body paragraphs, not tiny ones. Most students are probably going to have like a 4-paragraph essay. Some students are probably going to have a 5-paragraph essay. So what that looks like really depends on you. So intro and 3 bodies, or intro, 2 bodies and a conclusion, or a 5-paragraph essay. I wouldn't force a 5-paragraph essay if you can't. Like, I've seen some students do it because they think that's like better. Do what works for your writing style. I have seen someone do like a 6-paragraph essay before. It's totally up to you, but like, think about the rubric when you're trying to make those decisions. Developing your ideas is always best. So ask yourself, have I really said all I can say about this before I move on to my next point? Because chances are sometimes students tend to move like too quickly. What questions can we ask to create commentary? Why the author is doing what they're doing, why this choice for this audience on this occasion. Check out the commentary videos that I have, because it might answer that. How do I implement soapstone? So like, a lot of times it happens in your intro, like especially your thesis. So like in so-and-so's, whatever the tone is, speech kind of thing, and you're establishing that. Or so-and-so gave a speech to this group of graduates, and like, you just kind of include that in your intro. That's kind of like the first part, just to give your reader a sense of what you're talking about. And then as you're writing the body paragraphs, you're going to examine essentially how the writer tailors their message, or like whatever they're doing, to their audience. Because if it's a letter, let's say it's like a letter of a mother to a son, that mother is going to make certain choices in that letter because of the son and the fact that they're writing to the son. Or if it's someone speaking to graduates on their graduation day, they're going to have a specific purpose and they're going to tailor their message to that occasion. So you want to think about how the different elements of soapstone are related in terms of those choices. And so ask yourself, okay, why are they either giving this speech, or why are they writing this letter? If it's an article, like maybe what caused them to write it, and how are they tailoring it to their audience? One thing that I think is helpful is thinking about like either the writer's like beliefs or values and their needs, and then the audience's beliefs or values or needs. Because if they're giving a speech, sometimes there are like shared values or shared needs. So why are those people listening to the speech? Think about like the location of the speech. Sometimes that's actually really helpful, because a lot of times if we're speaking to a group of people, then we tailor it to that particular like state or town or country or whatever it is. So for instance, like if I was going to give a speech at a high school, I would want to tailor it to that high school versus like the next town over, because you want to connect with your audience. So think about those choices as well. So what do you know about the audience's values and things like that? Or what do you know about the writer? You might not always know a lot about the writer, because sometimes it's a famous person, sometimes it's not. So sometimes there's clues in the passage about that as well, as far as like what their goals are and what they need. Okay, so try to answer a few more questions. I really appreciate you guys like sticking with me and asking these questions. I'm trying to answer them as well. How can I improve sophistication? Check out my sophistication video. No guarantees that you will get the sophistication point, but those were some tips that I had for students on that. Just ideas. It's seriously a lifesaver. Well, thank you. I aim to please. So I'm hoping that I didn't stress anyone out. I'm really trying to answer all these questions. What's the difference between long and short sentences? In terms of analyzing them, so like short sentences, sometimes are like often separated on their own in passages, sometimes they're not. But short sentences can be more impactful because they're more direct. Long sentences tend to have more clauses and maybe like qualifying information. So if you're looking at a shorter sentence, I might look at like its location. A lot of times they're at the end of a paragraph, though not always. But they are more direct. They give the audience a sense of like, I don't know, like what to do or what to think. And then longer sentences tend to be more involved, and they tend to incorporate more like specificity and things like that. So you as a writer also want to vary your syntax. You don't want all your sentences to be one length, so you want to include clauses and stuff as well. So just kind of try to vary your syntax a little bit. One of the benefits to sentence frames is that when teachers tend to write them, we try to include like more advanced syntax anyway. That way that way, like, it helps students vary their syntax. What would be your best guess as to how many points? I don't know. If it were up to me, like, because I hate math, I would do like a 6 is a 5 composite and work my way down. But it really depends on the complexity of the passage. This is why I am not in charge of this. It depends on the complexity of the passage. So the harder the passage could mean that you need a lower cut score in order to achieve a certain composite. And also they did say that they will be read or like looked at twice. So I assumed that meant averaging, but they never, as far as I saw, they never explicitly said that. So I'm sure the readers will get more clarification, but we don't really know right now. So I would say, like, best guess would be shoot for what you believe is a 4 out of 6 on the rubric, just because to me a 3 sounds too low, and I think expecting people to make a 5, even if it is an easy passage, is a bit high. So that would just kind of be my guess. If I ruled the world, that's what we would do, but I'm not in charge. How do I keep calm? Positive self-talk. So I know it's really hard to like not let that defeatist attitude kind of creep in, and like sometimes it's like a bodily response, like you can't control it. I've dealt with anxiety before. I've had like my heart racing and I was about ready to cry, and people would be like, just calm down. And it's like, thanks, that's not helpful. So you need to do what works best for you. Some people like to tap their fingers, some people like to tap their foot, some people twirl their hair, some people take deep breaths. The one thing I would say is, like, mentally, don't think that you've already failed. I would try to flip the situation and view it as a positive, like, I have prepared for this is hard, but I'm going to conquer this, as opposed to thinking of like the negative. So that would be my best advice. And then, like, I have found that, like, if you're talking about keeping calm during the submission window, that would probably be something else to consider, which is just that, like, when I rush, I make mistakes. So there are times when I'm panicking and I have to tell myself, stop, slow down, you know how to do this. I would recommend practicing how you're going to submit. I know you kind of have to simulate it. There is a demo, but that way, hopefully you don't make little mistakes, and there are certain things you can do to prepare in advance. So sometimes preparation actually helps you from panicking. If I run out of time, should I still include a conclusion? Not if you need to focus on your body paragraphs. Just my opinion. Body paragraphs to me are so much more important. Do you think it will be a speech? Okay, so some of you are going to get a speech, I would hope. You guys are going to have different passages. From what I know of AP Lit, there were at least 10, though I heard one teacher say 15, not totally sure. So you are going to get a different passage most likely than your peers. Someone said they thought it was based on time zone, but I'm not entirely sure that that's accurate. What I do know is for like the histories, from what I heard from one of the AP history teachers was like, there were like 4 possible topics, but then within those topics, students had different documents. So I think it's entirely possible that students need to expect either a speech, a letter, an article, or maybe a memoir or biography. So I would kind of prepare for those. They've done a lot of speeches and letters recently. So I was like, before this all happened, like before COVID happened, I was expecting it to not be a speech or letter, or to not be an American influence, because like last year was Gandhi. But now that there are potentially multiple passages, I don't know. So just kind of keep that in mind. I would like implore you to remember that like how you approach it really doesn't change. But if I had a choice, I would want a speech, but you unfortunately don't get to pick that. That'd be awesome though, if you could like pick like your time period and like what type of passage it was. That would be pretty cool. But they're not gonna let you guys do that. Okay, so let me see if there are any last questions. Why are we having different passages? It's to prevent cheating. So it's basically just to prevent people from being able to communicate with each other. But you are being evaluated based on your individual passage. So it does not matter what your friend does on their passage. You only need to worry about what you do for yours. Don't worry about what other people do if they have the same passage as you. I know it probably sounds like a little bit, you know, like, oh, okay, but really honestly only focus on you and your passage. It's just a way to deter it. I even do that honestly in my own classes. So like if I have 3 sections of AP Lang, I choose 3 prompts that are comparable, but I give first period one. This year I had first, sixth, and eighth period. So first period would get one, sixth period would get another, and eighth period would get a different one. And when I first started teaching, I would give different passages within the same class. That got to be really hard to keep up with though. So do I have a video about annotating? I'm working on one now that should be up tomorrow. I know I've mentioned it in other videos. I did a video about like 3 ways to annotate if you're like looking at a computer screen. That's not what it's called, but it's something there. I did that like really early on in COVID. So the advice, it's a longer video, and it shows like 3 different ways to do it, like 3 different approaches. Take that for what it is. I truly believe that students need to adapt like stuff to their learning style. So basically it was kind of talking about some different ways you could essentially create a graphic organizer. I personally just kind of like do like free form notes, which was one of the things I showed as well. So that would probably be my best advice, is choose an annotation style that works for you. Is there a difference between like message versus arguments? Yes and no. How you approach it is not different, but like, for instance, when they used message, like Madeleine Albright had a message of perseverance that was more like uplifting, but like an argument, you're usually arguing for or against something. So even though she was arguing that they should persevere, it wasn't like, argument tends to be a little bit more forceful, I guess. So just kind of note which word they're using, but as far as like how you would approach it, like it really doesn't change. So is there like a difference? Yes, but it's based on like what the passage says. I don't think it's something that you guys really need to worry about at this point. But that is something that like maybe for next year's students, I will try to create a video about, but I would just kind of zero in on the word that they use and just kind of go with it, because it really just depends on the passage. Okay, so let's see. We've been on here for a little while. I'm happy to take a few more questions. I actually have to go pick up my toddler son at my parents' house in a little bit, so I can stay on for maybe 5-10 minutes max. So I will try to answer as many questions as I can. So, all right, speed round. What do we have? What do we still need to know? Yeah, so a lot of you are asking questions that I did answer, and like, so if you guys, I see some of you helping in the chat, thank you so much. So if it's something that you can answer, like please do so, and I will upload the video so you guys can go back and watch it if you need to. And some of the info is available from the College Board as well, and other stuff is hopefully in videos if needed. So final thoughts on like pacing and stuff. Just really make sure that you guys are watching that timer. I don't know if you guys know this because it came out yesterday, but the College Board has said that if you get a message that talks about like, we did not receive your response, you're going to get like an email address that you can email to. That was not an option last week, but it's an option now. So hopefully that will help you guys submit successfully. Can you use casual word choice? I would caution against that. It depends on what you're talking about, but like, I would avoid like idioms, and like expressions like paints a picture for the reader, words like gonna and shoulda, like kinda, I would avoid those. So can you be candid or like a little bit casual? Yes, but it kind of depends on what you mean by that. But I would say in general, remember who your readers are. They are essentially AP Lang teachers or professors. So you want to kind of cater toward the academic, but like don't go over the top sophisticated either. I had to tell one of my own students to kind of dial it back a little bit because she was using like Latin terms for stuff that I was having to Google, and I was like, one of the words was like this really fancy word for unique, and I was like, just tell me it's unique, like please. So not that I couldn't understand what she was saying, but we don't want to go over the top academic because it's fluffy and it kind of looks like you don't really know what you're talking about, even if you do. But we also don't want to write this as if we're talking to like our best friends. So kind of find that like happy medium where it's academic. So just a couple of tips there. Okay, so let's see, any final questions? I know a lot of you have been rating a ton of really good ones. How can I analyze irony? I don't see a lot of irony when I read the passages. Maybe it's just because I'm not looking for it, but I tend not to write about irony, so I'm probably not the best person to answer that one. I see it more in fiction, but not so much in nonfiction. So I'm sorry if that like either does or doesn't help. But I would have to, I guess, see a specific example to tell you, but I don't generally find irony when I look at these pieces, but maybe it's just because of the pieces I'm reading. How much time should we spend on the essay itself? I would say at least 30 to 35 minutes for sure. Can you describe a rhetorical choice instead of using the word yes? Actually, that's sometimes better because it sounds a little bit less pretentious. Could the prompt be satire? In theory, yes, but like, I hope that if it is, they tell you that. They're starting to tell students like more clues. Satire can be difficult to understand the rhetorical situation of. So if they did, I think they would have to choose something that had a very clear rhetorical situation, or they would have to tell you. Like, I know a few years ago they chose something from The Onion, and The Onion always does satire, but I just don't know that they would do that now. But again, they have to come up with more prompts, so maybe I would say it's less likely. I think like they tend to do it more in the multiple choice, but I don't want to tell you, oh, it's not going to be satire, because I don't know. I would just say that hopefully they would clue you in on it if it was. So just something to keep in mind. College Board has time practices, yes. If you go onto AP Classroom, they have some new stuff that you can use. And I don't know if students can set their own timer, but as teachers, I know we can set a timer. I was having problems with AP Classroom earlier this week, so I just gave up on it, to be honest. How do we create a consistent line of reasoning? Try to connect your ideas throughout your paragraphs using transitions between paragraphs and within paragraphs. Just making sure that you are kind of working chronologically. That's usually a better way to create a line of reasoning, and also be logical. Like, you don't want to kind of jump to conclusions as you're writing. Is it possible they could give us a prompt from the practice? I don't think so. I don't think they would. I think these are like top secret prompts, to be honest. They don't reuse prompts, so I don't think so. Which rhetorical choices are most prevalent? I have a video on this, but like in general, I would say look for things like repetition, comparison, contrast, maybe the appeals. But if they're not there, then don't like try to find them. Like, not every passage is going to have a comparison. Not every passage is going to have repetition. So focus on what you think the writer is doing. So it's good to know sort of like the most common ones, but at the same time, you need to zero in on what your passage actually is talking about. How do we deal with being redundant? So good question. I think sometimes varying your word choice a little bit can help. Also, if you're trying to like dig into the rhetorical situation, maybe you focus more heavily on something in one paragraph and then kind of back off and focus on something else in the next paragraph. Like, maybe you analyze why that choice for that particular audience in like a little bit more heavily, and then maybe you focus on the occasion. Sometimes though it does get a little bit redundant, and I know that's like not good, but you do have to remember that you only have 45 minutes. So if you notice that you're being redundant, I would maybe take a second to pause and say, okay, what else can I say? Like, so what? Why is this significant? Or what else is the writer doing here? But at the end of the day, like, if you, like, yes, you don't want to be redundant, but I would still at least keep writing if you can. So, okay, a lot of people seem to be struggling with identifying choices and timing and stuff. Do I recommend a certain number of paragraphs? You need to do what's best for you. Minimum of 2 body paragraphs is usually what I would say. Some people do 3. Let's see. I think a lot of these I've honestly covered. I'm really sorry if I didn't answer somebody's question. I will try to, if it's like something that I think is super major, I will try to like put it in the comments when I upload this or something. But I think a lot of these we've covered. Okay, so I'm just gonna like maybe wait like a few more minutes to just kind of go over a few, and then I'm going to have to kind of close this down. Where can we find the timed practices? I believe for you guys, you would just access them through AP Classroom, but you can also go on the College Board's website and you can make your own timed practice. So you can literally find their prompt and just set your own timer. And that would be as close as you could get to. You don't have to have it like be a timer on the screen. You can make your own timed right. Like I had my students just time themselves. Yes, I have videos on sentence frames. Usually that's in the title, so it's easier to find. Tips for finding devices quickly: ask what the writer is doing, focus on verbs, not like devices, if that makes sense. Do you think reviewing high scoring essays from past years will help? Yes, especially the ones that have been calibrated with the new rubric. So they did 2018 and 2019 with the new rubric, which would be Gandhi and Albright. I would look at those. If you're looking at something that was on the 9-point rubric, I would say look at at least a 6+ out of 9. So the College Board website will have the prompts, and I Googled, I think it was like Albright's. I was looking for it the other day, and the 9-point rubric came up and those samples. So you might want to specify that you want the 6-point rubric. I am a visual learner, so I really like to look at samples. And so if you are also a visual learner, or if you're trying to just kind of figure out what to do, then those are official samples scored by the College Board. So that's where I would go. And I would look at anything that is like top scoring and just kind of see what they're doing. For the like 6-point ones, it's kind of annoying, but I understand why they did it. It's like 2 separate docs. You're going to have to click on the one that says the student samples, and that's going to be all the essays. They do it highest to lowest usually. And then the second document is going to be the scoring commentary. So they used to put them in the same doc, and now they're separate. So FYI, you're going to have to click on 2 separate things. What if I don't understand the text? Take it in small parts. Ask yourself, what is the writer really saying? And if you get really stuck, move on, because sometimes there might be one part that's confusing, but don't get tripped up on that. You might be able to understand the rest of it. Sometimes you need to keep reading for it to make sense. But like really kind of go like sentence by sentence or paragraph by paragraph if you need to. Okay, so I think that's gonna be it for today, guys. I really appreciate you guys taking your time to ask these questions. So I will upload this. And I will kind of answer any major questions in the comment section of that, like later tonight if I can. If there's anything that I like completely missed, if I did not answer your question, I totally apologize. Next time I do this, I'm gonna have someone like keeping track of questions for me, because I'm like trying to focus and not get distracted. So you guys are so welcome. So if you have questions, I do try to respond to comments on my videos as well. So if you need to contact me, I try to respond to those. And also I am on Instagram, but I have like a really small following over at Coach Hall Writes on Insta. So because I don't know, I don't use it a ton, but I do post there as well. So that's another way to contact me if you want to. All right, so best of luck, guys. Do the very best you can. I believe in you. Write as much as you can. Is there a difference between AP Lit and AP Lang? It's basically fiction versus nonfiction. So yeah, most of you will take AP Lit next year, maybe, who knows? So anyway, I'm going to stop this live stream, but anyway, if you guys have additional questions, then please consult other videos, or just kind of keep checking the channel. I have at least 2 more videos that are launching tomorrow. Don't know the exact time yet because I'm not done with them, sorry, but I will get those up for you guys as soon as I can. It's kind of like the last 2 major things. People wanted a like annotate with me video and a rating your essay video, and so those kind of take a while. So those will be the last 2 that I intend to do, and then if there's anything like huge that I missed or like frequent request, if I can do a quick one, I will before the exam. So just make sure you guys log on to that test 30 minutes early and have everything ready in advance, and just do your very best. All right, so thanks guys. I'm glad it was helpful, and I hope to hear back from you guys after the test. I hope it goes well. So good luck. Thank you.